In the summer of 793, the people of England had no warning that their world was about to change forever. There were no omens they could understand, no armies massing at their borders, no declarations of war. Life along the English coast moved slowly, shaped by prayer, farming, and the steady rhythm of the sea. Monasteries stood as symbols of peace and divine protection, their walls holding not weapons but manuscripts, gold chalices, and the belief that God's sanctuary could not be violated. England itself was not a single nation yet, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, each ruled by kings who spent more time fighting one another than preparing for threats from beyond the horizon. This political fragmentation created a dangerous illusion of safety. The sea was seen as a barrier, not a highway, and the men who would soon cross it were completely unknown to the English world. Across the North Sea, in Scandinavia, a very different reality shaped the lives of the Norse people. Harsh climates, short growing seasons, and limited farmland placed constant pressure on Viking communities. Power was local, loyalty personal, and wealth often determined leadership. Young men grew up hearing stories of distant lands rich with silver, fertile soil, and undefended religious centers. At the same time, advances in shipbuilding transformed the sea from an obstacle into an opportunity. The Viking longship, fast, shallow-drafted, and capable of both open ocean travel and river navigation, gave Norse raiders an unmatched strategic advantage. These ships were not built for large armies, but for speed, surprise, and terror. The Vikings did not think in terms of conquest at first, they thought in terms of opportunity. When the first Viking ships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne, they did not arrive with banners or demands. They came silently, their oars cutting through the water with practiced precision. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in Christian England, a monastery revered across Europe. Its isolation, meant to bring monks closer to God, also made it defenseless. The attack was swift and brutal. Monks were killed or dragged away into slavery, sacred relics were stolen, and the monastery was left in ruins. The shock rippled across England and beyond. Chroniclers described the event as divine punishment, struggling to understand how such horror could occur in a place dedicated to God. Yet this was not an isolated tragedy, it was a warning. Politically, England was unprepared to respond. Northumbria, where Lindisfarne was located, was already weakened by internal power struggles and assassinations. Mercia and Wessex watched from a distance, unsure whether this attack was a one-time disaster or the beginning of something far worse. No unified defense strategy existed, and coastal protection was minimal. The Vikings understood this weakness quickly. They returned year after year, striking monasteries, towns, and trading ports. Each raid provided them with silver, weapons, captives, and, most importantly, knowledge. They learned the geography of England's rivers, the response times of local forces, and the political divisions that prevented coordinated resistance. As the raids increased, so did their scale and ambition. What began as seasonal hit-and-run attacks slowly evolved into organized campaigns. By the mid-9th century, Viking leaders realized that England offered more than loot. Its land was fertile, its population divided, and its defenses inconsistent. The arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army in 865 marked a turning point. This was not a small raiding party but a large, coordinated force with clear political goals. Instead of leaving after the fighting season, the Vikings stayed through winter, occupying territory and forcing English kings into desperate negotiations. Tribute payments, known as Danelaw, became a common response, temporary solutions that drained English wealth while encouraging further invasions. The human cost of these early invasions was devastating. Villages were burned, trade routes disrupted, and entire communities displaced. Slavery became a grim reality, with thousands of English men, women, and children sold in markets across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world. Churches and monasteries, once centers of learning and stability, were reduced to rubble, setting back literacy and record-keeping for generations. The psychological impact was just as severe. The Vikings were portrayed as unstoppable, godless warriors, their reputation amplified by fear and rumor. For ordinary people, the sound of approaching ships meant panic, flight, or death. Yet even in this darkness, the foundations of change were being laid. Some English leaders began to adapt, learning from Viking tactics and reorganizing defenses. Others chose cooperation over resistance, setting the stage for settlement rather than constant warfare. The Viking invasions were no longer just about destruction, they were becoming part of England's political reality. This first phase of the conflict did not decide the future of England, but it shattered the old world completely. The sea had opened, the illusion of isolation was gone, and a new era of conflict, adaptation, and survival had begun, one that would test every kingdom in England for nearly 3 centuries. By the late 9th century, the Viking presence in England had shifted from sudden terror to constant pressure, and the nature of the war changed in ways that frightened English rulers even more than the early raids. The Vikings no longer came only to strike and flee, they came to stay, to negotiate, to threaten, and to rule. The great heathen army moved deliberately across the landscape, exploiting every weakness left by England's divided politics. Northumbria collapsed first, torn apart by internal rivalries and unable to resist a disciplined enemy that understood both fear and strategy. York fell, not just as a city but as a symbol, and with it went the illusion that English kings could protect their people through tradition alone. The Vikings installed their own leaders, collected tribute, and used captured towns as operational bases, proving that this war was no longer seasonal violence but a long struggle for control. As the invaders advanced, Mercia became the next target. Once the most powerful English kingdom, it now stood weakened by decades of internal conflict and shifting alliances. Viking commanders understood timing. They attacked when Mercian leadership was divided and support from neighboring kingdoms was uncertain. Towns surrendered without battles, calculating that survival under foreign rule was better than annihilation. Others resisted and paid the price. Fields were destroyed, food supplies seized, and populations scattered. The Viking strategy was ruthless but effective. Starve resistance, reward cooperation, and move on before unified opposition could form. Each victory fed the army with resources and confidence, allowing it to grow stronger the deeper it pushed into English territory. Wessex emerged as the final major barrier to complete Viking domination, and it was here that the war took on its most dramatic and personal dimension. The kingdom was led by Alfred, a ruler who understood that England faced not just invasion but transformation. Unlike many of his rivals, Alfred recognized that traditional armies were too slow and predictable to counter Viking mobility. Early on, even he suffered crushing defeats. Viking forces burned towns, defeated armies, and forced Alfred into hiding, reducing a king to a fugitive in his own land. For a time, it seemed inevitable that Wessex would fall like the kingdoms before it, and with it any remaining hope of English independence. What followed was not a sudden miracle but a painful process of adaptation. Alfred studied his enemy carefully. He learned how the Vikings used speed, surprise, and intelligence to control territory. In response, he reorganized Wessex's defenses, building fortified towns known as burhs, positioned so that no community was more than a day's march from protection. He reformed the army, creating a rotating system that allowed soldiers to fight while still maintaining farms and supplies. Most importantly, he challenged the Vikings at sea, commissioning ships designed to counter longships and disrupt coastal raids. These changes did not end the war, but they slowed the Viking advance and restored something England had lost: time. Battles during this period were brutal and decisive, but rarely clean victories for either side. The fighting was close, personal, and unforgiving. Shield walls collided, spears shattered, and the ground became slick with blood and mud. Losses were heavy on both sides. Entire fighting generations were wiped out in single campaigns, leaving communities without defenders or heirs. Disease followed armies, spreading through camps and towns already weakened by hunger and displacement. Civilians bore the heaviest burden, trapped between armies that lived off the land and saw supplies as spoils of war. The countryside itself became a weapon, stripped bare to deny resources to the enemy. Despite Alfred's eventual successes, including key victories that forced Viking leaders into treaties, peace was fragile and incomplete. Large areas of eastern and northern England fell under what became known as the Danelaw, regions where Viking law, customs, and leadership dominated daily life. This was not a temporary occupation but a reshaping of society. Norse settlers brought families, established farms, and integrated into local economies. Towns grew around trade rather than monasteries, and silver replaced land as a primary measure of wealth. English and Norse cultures collided and blended, creating new identities that blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. Politically, England entered a dangerous balance. Treaties recognized Viking-controlled territories, but trust was minimal and violence always close. Tribute payments continued, draining English resources and funding further Viking ambitions. Some English nobles allied with Viking leaders to strengthen their own positions, deepening internal divisions. Meanwhile, new waves of Scandinavian warriors arrived, drawn by stories of land and opportunity rather than pure plunder. The war was no longer simply about invasion. It was about coexistence under constant threat, where every generation inherited unfinished conflict. By the end of this phase, England was scarred but not broken. Wessex survived, setting the foundation for future resistance, while large parts of the country transformed under Norse influence. The Vikings had proven they could defeat kings, rule territory, and reshape societies. Yet they had also discovered that England was not easily consumed. The struggle had evolved into something far more complex than either side had anticipated, a prolonged contest of endurance, identity, and power that would erupt again with even greater force in the generations to come. As the 10th century unfolded, the war entered a quieter but more dangerous phase, one where battles were not always fought with swords but with laws, marriages, and shifting loyalties. The Danelaw was no longer just occupied land. It had become a living system where Norse settlers and English communities existed side by side, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as partners. Viking leaders ruled as kings and earls, collecting taxes, enforcing their own legal codes, and encouraging permanent settlement. Farms spread across once raided countryside, towns expanded into trade centers, and rivers that had carried longships now carried goods. To many outsiders, it appeared as though the violence had settled into an uneasy peace, but beneath the surface, tension never disappeared. Every agreement carried the memory of bloodshed, and every generation grew up knowing that war could return without warning. English rulers, especially those descended from Alfred, understood that survival depended on patience and strategy rather than constant open warfare. They began a slow campaign to reclaim lost territories, not always through conquest but through pressure and negotiation. Fortified towns multiplied, trade routes were protected, and a sense of English identity strengthened around shared language, religion, and law. At the same time, Viking settlers were changing as well. Many converted to Christianity, married into English families, and adopted local customs. Norse names filled English records, and English words entered Norse speech. This blending created stability, but it also created ambiguity about loyalty. When new Viking armies arrived from Scandinavia, they did not encounter a clear enemy but a landscape filled with people who were both English and Norse. The return of large-scale violence came when ambitious Scandinavian kings looked west again, drawn by the wealth England continued to generate. These were no longer loosely organized raiding bands but professional forces led by rulers who believed England should be part of their empires. The English response was stronger than in earlier centuries, but it was also strained. Maintaining defenses required enormous resources, and repeated tribute payments weakened royal authority. Each time silver was handed over to buy peace, it signaled both survival and vulnerability. The population paid the price through heavy taxation, forced labor, and the constant threat of renewed invasion. Battles during this period were less chaotic than earlier clashes but no less destructive. Armies were larger, logistics more complex, and objectives clearer. Control of key towns, ports, and river crossings determined success. Losses mounted steadily, not always through dramatic slaughter but through attrition. Soldiers died from wounds that festered, from exposure during long campaigns, and from disease spreading through crowded camps. Civilians suffered crop failures caused by armies marching repeatedly across the same land. Famines followed wars, and famine killed silently, claiming more lives than many battles ever did. Chroniclers recorded fewer heroic victories and more exhausted compromises, reflecting a society worn down by generations of conflict. Politically, England stood at a crossroads. Strong kings could enforce unity and push back Viking power, but weak leadership invited disaster. Succession crises became moments of extreme danger, as rival claimants sought Viking support to secure thrones. This strategy often backfired, giving foreign leaders leverage over English politics. Viking kings learned to exploit these divisions, presenting themselves as protectors or allies before revealing their true ambitions. The line between invasion and invitation blurred, and England's fate increasingly depended on the character and decisions of individual rulers rather than sheer military strength. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the scale of the conflict reached new heights. Scandinavian rulers demanded not just tribute but recognition and control. Entire regions were mobilized for war, and England's economy was pushed to its limits. Silver flowed out of the kingdom in staggering amounts, funding Viking campaigns across Europe while weakening domestic stability. Ordinary people lived under constant uncertainty, never knowing whether a year of hard work would end in prosperity or destruction. Churches prayed for peace while stockpiling supplies, and towns reinforced walls that had already been rebuilt multiple times. Yet even as pressure increased, English resistance did not collapse. Administrative systems improved, taxation became more organized, and military responses grew more coordinated. The idea of England as a single realm strengthened, forged by shared suffering and common enemies. At the same time, Viking ambitions intensified rather than faded. England was no longer just a target, it was a prize worth ruling. This mutual escalation ensured that the coming conflicts would not be brief or limited. They would decide not just who controlled England, but what England would become. By the end of this chapter of the war, it was clear that coexistence had reached its limits. The balance between settlement and invasion had tipped again toward open conquest. Both sides were more experienced, more ruthless, and more determined than ever before. The stage was set for a final, dramatic struggle, one that would bring legendary leaders, catastrophic losses, and a decisive transformation of power that no treaty could delay any longer. The early 11th century shattered any remaining illusion that England could buy peace or balance power through compromise, as the war entered its most violent and decisive phase. Scandinavian ambition now centered on outright conquest, driven by kings who commanded vast resources and disciplined forces. Among them, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark emerged as a relentless figure, determined to claim England not as a raiding ground but as a crown. His campaigns were systematic and unforgiving, targeting the economic heart of the kingdom and breaking resistance through fear and exhaustion. English defences, though stronger than in earlier centuries, struggled to withstand the scale and coordination of these invasions. Towns that had survived generations of conflict faced destruction once again, and the population endured levels of pressure unseen since the first Viking landings. The English response under King Ethelred was marked by hesitation and inconsistency, earning him a reputation for weakness that would haunt the kingdom. Heavy tribute payments continued, reaching enormous sums that drained silver from every corner of society. These payments funded further Viking campaigns, creating a cycle where England financed the very forces destroying it. Militarily, English armies were raised repeatedly, only to be dismissed or defeated due to poor leadership and lack of unity. Noble factions undermined one another, and trust between king and subjects eroded. The cost of this instability was measured not only in lost battles but in lost faith, as people questioned whether their rulers could protect them at all. Violence during this period was relentless and often indiscriminate. Raids escalated into widespread devastation, with entire regions stripped of food and resources. The massacre of Danish settlers in England, ordered in a desperate attempt to eliminate internal threats, only intensified the conflict. This act transformed the war into a personal vendetta for Scandinavian leaders, justifying even harsher retaliation. Villages were erased, churches burned, and trade collapsed in affected areas. Death came through sword and fire, but also through hunger and disease, as displaced populations crowded into unsafe conditions. The psychological toll was immense, leaving deep scars that no victory could erase. Sweyn's eventual success forced Ethelred into exile, marking a humiliating turning point in English history. For the first time, England was ruled by a Scandinavian king, and the reality of foreign domination became undeniable. Although Ethelred briefly returned after Sweyn's death, the balance of power had already shifted. Sweyn's son, Nut, proved even more capable, blending military strength with political intelligence. He recognized that lasting control required more than fear. After defeating English forces in brutal campaigns, including battles that cost thousands of lives, Nut positioned himself as a legitimate ruler rather than an occupier. Under Nut, England experienced a strange and fragile stability. Viking warriors were rewarded with land, and English nobles who submitted retained influence. Law and taxation were reorganized to serve a unified kingdom that stretched across England and Scandinavia. Yet this stability rested on the memory of immense bloodshed. Fields lay abandoned, populations reduced, and entire lineages erased by years of war. The economy slowly recovered, but only after paying an enormous human price. The war had reshaped England's leadership, culture, and sense of identity, forcing people to adapt to rule by men whose ancestors had once been seen as monsters from the sea. Despite the appearance of peace, the foundations of Knut's empire were fragile. His authority depended on personal strength rather than lasting institutions, and rival claims waited patiently for weakness. When he died, the unity he had imposed began to fracture almost immediately. England found itself once again vulnerable to external ambition and internal rivalry. The long war had exhausted the kingdom, leaving it powerful in experience but fragile in cohesion. The stage was now set for the final act of the Viking Age in England, a dramatic confrontation that would decide whether the Norse legacy would dominate or finally give way to a new English order. The final years of the Viking Age in England unfolded with a sense of inevitability, as though centuries of conflict were narrowing toward a single, decisive reckoning. After the collapse of Knut's empire, England entered a period of uncertainty, ruled by kings who lacked the authority and strength to command lasting loyalty. Power shifted quickly, and with each transition, the kingdom grew more exposed. Scandinavian rulers watched closely, aware that England's wealth and strategic position remained as tempting as ever. The old patterns returned, but now they carried the weight of generations of bloodshed and ambition. When new invasions came, they were driven not by exploration or survival, but by the belief that England's throne could be taken and held by force. The war reached its climax in a series of brutal confrontations that pushed England to its limits. Norwegian King Harald Hardrada, one of the most feared warriors of his age, launched an invasion that echoed the earliest Viking raids but on a far greater scale. His army cut deep into northern England, meeting resistance in battles that were savage and costly. The clash left thousands dead, including Hardrada himself, ending one of the last great Viking attempts at conquest. Yet this victory offered England no relief. Almost immediately, another threat emerged from across the Channel, led by William of Normandy, whose forces carried both Viking heritage and new military tactics. England's army, exhausted from marching and fighting, faced this fresh invasion with little time to recover. The Battle of Hastings became the defining moment of the entire era, not just for its violence but for its consequences. The fighting was relentless, lasting from morning to dusk, with shield walls breaking and reforming under constant pressure. English losses were catastrophic. Warriors who had defended the kingdom for years fell alongside newly raised soldiers, and leadership was decimated in a single day. When the English king was killed, the resistance collapsed, not because courage failed, but because there was no one left to hold it together. The battlefield was littered with the dead, and the future of England lay among them. In the aftermath, the true cost of centuries of Viking warfare became clear. Entire regions were left depopulated, their economic and social structures permanently altered. The constant cycle of invasion, tribute, and rebuilding had drained England's resources and reshaped its culture. Norse influence endured in language, law, place names, and trade networks, woven so deeply into society that it could never be erased. What ended in 1066 was not the Viking impact on England, but the age of open invasion. Raiders had become settlers, rulers, and finally part of the fabric of the land they once terrorized. England emerged from this long struggle transformed rather than defeated. The wars had forced centralization of power, stronger administration, and a clearer sense of national identity. The legacy of the Vikings lived on in the very systems designed to resist them. Their ships, weapons, and strategies changed how wars were fought. Their settlements changed how land was owned and governed. The old England of isolated kingdoms and vulnerable coasts was gone forever, replaced by a realm shaped through conflict and adaptation. The violence that had once seemed endless had forged a new order from its ashes. If you found real and accurate knowledge in our videos and believe they help you understand history beyond myths and exaggeration, support our work by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war series exploring the battles that changed the world.